Latif, if I could ask you a question that's related to your presentation earlier. I understand mega projects, as you showed in one of the charts, overwhelmingly over budget and over time. But and also, this notion of that sometimes mega projects may not be something that is required for a country, for example. But given that Indonesia is an emerging economy, whether we like it or not, in an emerging economy, sometimes, most of the time, supply leads demand, right? You have to build it so that they come. So what would be your advice in that situation? Would you still think mega projects are not the right thing to pursue, or do you think for emerging markets that's something that we'll have to do better, but ultimately we have to do?
Right. No, it's a very, very good question. And despite what I sound like, I'm not anti-mega projects. I think often they are, but we have to be realistic about the risks associated with them. And good management is overcoming those risks, and that's what good leadership is required. So I think, as you say, these tasks are inescapable. We have to undertake some of these big changes. My suggestion, and what I've sort of discovered in some of my research, is think big, but start relatively small. It doesn't need to be tiny, but you don't need to implement the entire project in one go. Stage it. To give you an example, the state of Alabama, in order to attract a number of European manufacturing companies to a variety of sites that were not necessarily suitable for big manufacturing because they were in swampy land, so you can't build heavy construction on them. It did a very innovative way of anchor tenancy. So it said, instead of building a huge amount of infrastructure right up front, let's attract one anchor tenant at a time. Let's build a bit of infrastructure for them today, but let's acquire the land around it now in order to expand that infrastructure, in this case a port, of as more capacity or more manufacturers arrived, that port could be used by more and more users. Similarly, they started developing electric transmission lines and the like, where the land rights were acquired for a much larger program than that was delivered in the first instance. And the idea is, by staging it, to breaking it down into 2 or 3 goes, you can reduce that risk and amortize your initial investment with an anchor tenant, and then once you can underwrite that investment, you can then keep expanding. Right. One final point I'll make on that, Raj, is on capability. Once a project team gets started, the first project will have more kinks in it than later projects. Simply because they haven't gotten used to working with each other, et cetera, et cetera. So once they have worked out, so Crossrail, for example, is so successful is because Andrew Wolstenholme, the CEO, has done a series of similar transport projects of increasing size in the last 15, 20 years of his career with very similar partners. And they've just gotten used to working with each other, and every single time they've worked out the various creases in these projects, and each project's gotten better and better. So Heathrow Express, St. Pancras, Terminal 5, Crossrail, etc.
So if I hear you
just add on that
correctly,
right?
Sorry.
I totally agree with the statement that I think we have to build the capacity as we go along. I think this is very important. It's also very important from our survey findings that you asked me earlier, that I think most local governments, they don't have the capability of building mega projects. And I think medium-sized, small-sized projects with the PPP structure would probably be a good learning instruments for them to go forward, going into bigger projects.
Dr. Atit mentioned, basically, you develop stage by stage, but start also something that, could be delivered. You mentioned the importance of the private sector to be an anchor tenant, for example, industry. That is actually the thinking right now that being developed, because in Indonesia, the project we can categorize into the one that actually support the industrial, industrial zone, because we need to grow more than 8% to be able to basically, the manufacturing sector. Right now it's around 4 to 5. It means we need to build the industrial zone, and that is with the anchor tenant, and then step by step the infrastructure built around them. That is what actually the plan that we have within 5 years. Actually, we have 14, but of course, with the limitation of resources, we are going to focus to some of it, that becoming later on the lesson learned. In addition of the industrial zone, we are also actually developing the tourism zone. Right now, we think about 10 tourism zones to be built. Yeah. That is also the approach, step-by-step approach, learning, and also capability actually later on will be built up.
Yeah. So therefore, the opportunities are not only on the infrastructure side, but also on the special economic zones, industrial estates, tourism-based development. But I want to come back to what Atif was saying, that one of the better ways of making much better outcome for projects is to actually starting one at a time. Therefore, the idea of, say for example, a couple of weeks ago it was in the media about Ministry of Transport saying they are going to invite private sector to buy minority shares in 20 airports and ports. Now, I would think that's probably not the best approach, because you rather start with one. So that's your message, right? Start with one that is large enough to attract the best private sector. From that learning, then you do the rest, then you do the one, then you do, right? So, Pak, if I can come back to you, given you are at the forefront of advising innovation in also on the funding strategies, you've been involved intimately in developing, say, for example, the limited concession schemes for the airports. Can you give us a little bit of background on that?
Yes, actually, in KPPIP, we try to do some exercising, giving kind of advice to the government on the financing for brownfield project. And this is the one that we try using the limited concession scheme. This is for the brownfield, and we think that learning from other countries, it seems it can be applied for airport. So in this case, we try to give some analysis comparing the LCS with securitization. With the LCS, the asset is still under the government or under the state-owned enterprise. And of course, in the LCS scheme, we try to convince to the Ministry of Transportation the benefit of the LCS to be applied in the best airport in Indonesia. With this example, it seems if it can be a success, then it can be applied for another airport. Another benefit also from the LCS is actually the government can get the upfront payment from the private sector who will operate the airport. And with this upfront payment, we can, the government or the state-owned enterprise can use for another airport. So I think this is kind of the idea from us, and we already discussed with various ministries. For example, Ministry of Transportation, Bappenas with Pak Wismana, and then also we already tried to talk to BUMN and also to Ministry of Finance. So, and also with the staff of the President office, yeah, we already discussed, and it seems that this idea is quite applicable for Indonesia.
That's excellent. So from private sector perspective, we can look forward to government coming up with pilot projects that are sufficiently large enough that will attract serious investors from all over the place, with the purpose of investing in one iconic investment, which then leads to a series of other investments. In a way, the model from Turkey for airport privatization seems like a good model. Nick, in your experience in the infrastructure and capital projects, do you see the capability of the consulting sector within Indonesia has that inclination for supporting projects that are privatization of, not necessarily privatization, but more concessioning of airports and ports?
From the consulting organisation's perspective,
Yeah.
the one thing consultants are very good at is adapting to opportunities to make money. So I'm sure that they will be absolutely up for doing it. I mean, I think the interesting point here is, are you going to attract the private investors into the Indonesian market? Similar to the speech that was given just before lunch in terms of, government puts money on the table, is the private sector going to come in as well? And we've recently done a survey of global investors and asked them what it is that attracts them to particular international markets and what turns them off. And there's probably two core issues. One is stability, political stability. If you have governments changing, then you have real challenges and there's little certainty. And the second point is actually quite similar, is regulatory stability. So governments that change the regulations around how assets work. It's more prevalent in the energy sector than perhaps in the airport sector, but nevertheless, if a government has a good track record for creating a stable regulatory and a stable political environment, that is what makes a huge difference. Track record helps, obviously, because investors like to invest in things they've invested in before that have done well. That is a challenge for an emerging economy because they haven't, by definition, got the same level of track record. But the thing about the airport sector, which is very positive, and I think you shouldn't forget about this, is that whilst you might be doing it for the first time, there are many other countries who've done it before. And a lot of these investors know what drives value in the airports market. They know what they are looking for in terms of key criteria for how you structure that investment opportunity. And if you take it through consultation process, and this is where consultants can absolutely help you, if you take the knowledge as what has worked, what hasn't worked, and structure your program of investment around that, then I would like to think that you will be successful. You'll certainly gain a lot of interest, particularly if you put a blue ribbon project like Jakarta Airport in there. And a number of countries, emerging and developed, have done it in batches actually. Rather than just one, you do 3 or 4 at a time. And actually, an investor can probably leverage more value by having 3 or 4 than having just one individual project. But I create the stable environment, create the right structure that allows the private sector to drive the value, then I'm sure you can be successful. And consultants will, I'm sure, work with you on it.
Thank you. That was not a loaded question, but but Pak Wisman, if I can come to you. Bappenas as the lead planning agency, one of the recent changes within Bappenas is you are gaining more, not necessarily power, but mandate for enabling budgets for the line ministries so that you can actually then instruct them to do projects based on government's priority. Do you have sufficient budget allocated for preparing the projects and enabling the line ministries to deliver?
Okay, Pak Ras, first of all, it's actually our task is really to have a plan for all the infrastructure in Indonesia. I think that could be financed by our own resources, meaning that rupiah financing, we call it, also actually could be supported by the development partners, as well as the one that related to private sector like PPP, and even also right now we are introducing the one that without the government intervention, but basically facilitation to have the debt equity like what Pak Wahyu mentioned. But I would like to touch upon Pak Nick for a moment, that basically this is, I think, the thinking, stability and structure. The structure that we are trying to employ right now through the SOE. One structure is the one that Pak Wahyu just mentioned, basically the airport. The other one that I mentioned is basically related to the toll road. This toll road is also actually being, how should I say, shared with the private sector to equity and debt. Now, based on that, the thinking is later on we are going basically to develop the structure, the regularity of the structure. That probably give confidence to the market. And somebody mentioned to me that sometimes they wonder upon the risk of the project, but if this is already a greenfield project, and in fact brownfield project, probably this is something that very interesting for the private sector, and that is if we could done that as examples, put the regulatory stable as well, then probably we can have more. Then I would like to touch upon your question about the preparation. That is really very necessary, and I think, you know, as Pak you mentioned, we need, of course, the colleague from the university. Sometimes we consult the university colleagues, also consultants, basically to prepare this. To have a better preparation, right now the government have a program actually. Well, I have to mention that a program with the ADB amounted as much as 147 million rupiah is basically to enhance the quality of the project, to enhance the quality of project on the beginning. Yeah, by what? By actually having the panel consultant, two things over there. One is the quality of the resources, and the second one is actually also the amount of resources that we can deploy basically to prepare the project, because this is also important. So with also the other one that we already working on the land acquisition, the law number 2 on land acquisition, as well as the preparation through what we call the LMAN, the provision of land through acquisition through what you call it, provision from the government buying the land and then to the private sector. I think with all the scheme that we would like to also develop together, this will be a package that hopefully can attract the private sector more and in a decent way.